My name is Shelby Bennett. I'm 30 now, but the night my father decided I wasn't worth the trouble, I was 18 standing in the hallway of the house I grew up in while he blocked the door, like I was some kind of problem he could just move outside and forget about, and I remember the exact way he said it because it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, controlled, like he was giving an order, "You're not worth the trouble anymore." And behind him, my sister was already inside my room with a tape measure checking the window like I had already been erased from the place before I even left it. And that was the part that didn't make sense yet, not in that moment, not while my brain was still trying to catch up to what was happening. Because I hadn't even been asked a question. There was no conversation. No, is this yours? No, explain this. Just a small plastic bag pulled out of my desk drawer like evidence in a trial that was already over, and I stood there looking at it, thinking I had never seen it before in my life, while my father pointed down the hallway and said, "Pack your things," like I had just failed some test I didn't know I was taking. And I turned to my mom because that's what you do. When something doesn't make sense, you look for the person who's supposed to fix it. But she was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart, and I said, "Mom, it's not mine," and she opened her mouth, and for a second, I thought she was going to say something that would stop all of it, something simple like, "Gerald, wait," but instead, my father cut her off before she even got a word out. And just like that, whatever chance I had disappeared, and she looked at the floor and said, "Just go, honey. Let him cool down." Which sounds reasonable until you realize nobody ever cools down when they've already made up their mind. And I knew it even then. I knew I wasn't leaving for the night. I was leaving for good, and that kind of realization doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in while you're upstairs, trying to figure out how to fit your life into a trash bag because you don't even own a suitcase. Your hands shaking so hard you can't fold a shirt properly, while your sister stands in the doorway pretending to be sorry, tilting her head like she's seen people do in movies, saying, "I'm so sorry this happened," while her eyes are scanning the room like she's already planning what she's going to do with it. And I didn't understand that either. Not yet, because my brain was still stuck on the part where my father didn't ask me a single question. And I kept thinking, if I just said the right thing, if I just explained it better, maybe this would stop, maybe this would rewind back into something normal. But nothing about that night was normal. Not the way my mother wouldn't look at me, not the way my father wouldn't look at me, not even when I dragged that black garbage bag down the stairs and past him, and out the front door he just stood there with his arms crossed, staring past me like I wasn't even in the picture anymore. And I remember thinking, this is it, this is really happening. I am walking out of my own house with everything I own in a trash bag, and nobody is stopping me. And the cold hit me. The second I stepped off the porch, that sharp November air that makes your lungs tighten up, and I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do. Got into my car, a 2003 Honda Civic that barely held itself together on a good day, turned the key, and the engine coughed like it wasn't sure it wanted to help me either. And I sat there for a second, with my hands on the wheel, waiting for someone to come out, waiting for a door to open, for my mom to call my name, for anything that would make this feel like a mistake that could still be fixed, but nothing happened. And then I heard my sister's voice through the screen door behind me, soft and calm, like she was explaining something obvious. "I tried to warn you, Dad. She's been like this for months." And that was the moment something inside me just went quiet, not broken, just quiet, like my brain decided there was no point arguing with something that had already been decided without me. And I pulled out of the driveway with $42 in my pocket. No plan. Nowhere to go, and a heater that blew nothing but cold air, which I didn't realize was going to matter as much as it did until later. Because at that point I was still stuck on one question that kept looping in my head over and over: how do you get thrown out of your own home without anyone even asking if you're telling the truth? And the answer, as it turns out, is simple. You don't get thrown out because of what you did. You get thrown out because someone already decided who you are. And once that decision is made, facts don't matter, explanations don't matter, you don't matter, and I wish I could tell you I handled it well. That I stayed calm and thought things through like a rational adult. But I was 18 sitting in a car that didn't have heat parked under a flickering light in a Walmart lot, because it was the only place I could think of that stayed open all night, staring at my phone, like it might magically fix something. If I just waited long enough and I didn't call anyone right away because I kept thinking my dad would call first, that maybe this was some kind of test, some extreme version of learn your lesson and come back. But the phone stayed quiet, no missed calls, no texts, nothing. And that silence was louder than anything he said that night because it told me exactly how serious he was about it. And I remember leaning my forehead against the steering wheel and laughing once, just once, because the whole thing felt so ridiculous, like there had to be a part of this I was missing, but there wasn't. This was it. This was the full story. A bag that wasn't mine, a father who didn't ask, a mother who didn't speak, and a sister who somehow seemed a little too prepared for all of it, and I sat there in that freezing car realizing something I didn't have the words for yet, that whatever family I thought I had before that night, it didn't exist anymore. And maybe it hadn't for a long time. I just hadn't noticed, because I was still living inside it. I gripped the edge of my steering wheel a little tighter than I needed to, not because of the cold, but because something about the way my sister looked at me that night wouldn't leave me alone, and it wasn't obvious at first. It wasn't some dramatic villain moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was small, almost forgettable if you weren't paying attention. The kind of thing your brain flags quietly and then keeps replaying later when the rest of the world finally shuts up long enough for you to hear it, because Jocelyn didn't act surprised when my dad found that bag, not even a little. And if you've ever seen someone get accused of something serious out of nowhere, you know, there's always a reaction, confusion, panic, denial, something. But she just stood there at the end of the hallway like she'd already watched this scene play out in her head and was just waiting for the credits to roll. And at the time, I told myself maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe she was just in shock. Maybe this whole thing had everyone acting weird. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation held up, because shock doesn't measure window frames. Shock doesn't come with a tape measure and a plan for new curtains, while your sister is still upstairs, trying to figure out how to pack her life into a garbage bag. And that image stuck with me more than anything else, her standing in my doorway, not looking at me but at the room like she was already moving in before I was even out. And when she said, "I'm so sorry this happened," it didn't land the way it should. Have it sounded right, the words were correct, but the tone was off too smooth, too practiced, like she was reading from a script she'd used before. And that's when I started to realize something I had ignored for years because it was easier not to see it. Jocelyn didn't just follow the rules in our house, she studied them. She understood exactly what my dad wanted to hear and when he wanted to hear it. And more importantly, she knew what he feared. And my dad feared losing control more than anything, especially when it came to anything that even looked like drugs. I didn't know the full story back then, not really just bits and pieces about someone he served with who didn't make it out the other side of addiction, but I knew enough to understand that once that switch flipped in his head, there was no turning it off. And Jocelyn knew that too. She knew exactly which buttons to press and which ones to avoid. And I started thinking about the weeks leading up to that night, the little comments she made that didn't seem like much at the time. The way she'd casually mention things like, "Shelby's been acting kind of weird lately," or "I don't know what she's doing upstairs half the time," always said lightly, like she wasn't making an accusation, just sharing an observation, planting seeds without ever having to take responsibility for what grew from them. And my dad, being who he is, didn't need much more than that. He doesn't do gray areas, he does threats and solutions, problems and removals. And suddenly that night didn't feel as random as it had before. It felt set up, not in some over-the-top movie plot kind of way, but in a quiet, calculated, almost boring kind of way, like moving pieces on a board 1 inch at a time, until everything is exactly where you need it to be. And I hate admitting that because it makes me sound paranoid, like I'm rewriting the past to make myself feel better. But the truth is, Jocelyn had always been good at controlling how people saw her, and by extension how they saw me. She was the golden child, the one who said yes sir, and meant it, the one who made my dad feel respected, which in our house was the same thing as being loved, and I was the opposite, the one who asked questions, the one who pushed back. Not because I wanted to cause problems, but because I didn't see the point in pretending something made sense when it didn't. And over time, that difference turned into a narrative not just in my dad's head, but in everyone's. Jocelyn was responsible. Shelby was difficult. Jocelyn was trustworthy. Shelby needed to be watched, and once that narrative was in place, it didn't take much to tip it over the edge. All it needed was something physical, something he could point to and say, "See, I was right." And that bag, that stupid little bag I had never seen before, became exactly that proof of a story that had already been written without me. And the more I sat there thinking about it, the more details started lining up in ways I couldn't ignore, like how my desk drawer, the one he opened, wasn't even the one I used most of the time, or how Jocelyn had been in my room earlier that week looking for something she claimed she misplaced, or how she always seemed just a step ahead of. Everything that happened, never surprised, never caught off guard, always ready with the right expression at the right time, and I don't know exactly when the thought first crossed my mind. The one I didn't want to think, because once you think it, you can't unthink it. But it was something like this. What if this wasn't an accident? What if none of this was? And I remember sitting there in that car staring out at the empty parking lot, realizing that if that was true, then everything changed. Not just what happened that night, but everything that led up to it, every conversation, every look, every moment. I brushed off because it was easier to believe we were still just a normal family with normal problems. And I felt this mix of anger and something else I didn't want to name, because anger I could deal with. Anger is simple. It points in one direction, but this other feeling was heavier, more complicated. It was the realization that the person who stood in that doorway, pretending to feel sorry for me, might have known exactly what was about to happen before I did. And instead of stopping it, instead of saying one honest sentence that could have changed everything, she stepped aside and let it happen. And even then, sitting there freezing in a car that barely worked, I still couldn't fully accept it. Because believing your own sister would set you up like that isn't something you just decide in one night. It's something your mind circles around, backs away from, comes back to later, testing it from different angles, looking for any other explanation that feels less brutal. But every time I replayed that hallway in my head, the same details kept standing out: the tape measure, the calm voice, the timing, and the worst part wasn't even the possibility that she did it. It was how easy it seemed for her to move on from it, like I was just a problem that had finally been handled. And that's when I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't just about getting me out of the house. It was about replacing me in it. And for the first time that night, the cold didn't feel like the worst thing I was dealing with anymore. I stared at my phone longer than I want to admit, thumb hovering over my dad's name, like it might change if I waited a second longer, and then I hit call, because that's what you do when your life just got flipped upside down. You try the person who caused it and hope maybe they've had a minute to think. Maybe they'll pick up and say, "This went too far, come home, we'll talk." But it rang once and went straight to a message telling me the number was unavailable. And it took me a second to process what that actually meant. Because people don't just become unavailable by accident. They choose it, and I sat there thinking maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the signal was bad. So I tried again and got the Same thing, and that's when it clicked. He didn't just throw me out. He made sure I couldn't reach him after, like he was sealing something off. And I wish I could say that was the worst part, but it wasn't, because then I called my mom, and that call rang, which somehow made it worse. Because now I knew the phone was working. Now I knew this wasn't a technical issue. This was a choice. And I counted the rings without meaning to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each one getting louder in my head. Each one feeling like a small confirmation that she was looking at the screen and deciding not to answer. And when it finally went to voicemail, I didn't even leave a message, because what was I supposed to say? Hey, just checking if I still exist. And I laughed at that, a short, ugly kind of laugh that comes out when something is too real to process properly. And then I called Jocelyn, not because I thought she would help, but because I needed to know if anyone in that house was going to act like I mattered at all. And that one didn't even ring. Straight to voicemail, instant, like she'd already made that decision before I even left the driveway. And I sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at 3 names that used to mean something and suddenly didn't. And it hit me all at once that this wasn't a misunderstanding that would clear up in the morning. This wasn't a bad night that would turn into an apology over breakfast. This was a clean break, planned or not, intentional or not. The result was the same. I was out and they were done, and the silence from all 3 of them said more than anything they could have explained. Because if even one of them had picked up, even just to check if I was okay, it would have meant there was still something there, some connection, some hesitation, but there wasn't. And that kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It happens when everyone involved has agreed, either out loud or quietly, to themselves, that this is how it's going to be. And the part that took me longer to understand was how quickly that silence spread beyond just them. Because I didn't hear from anyone else either. Not an aunt, not a cousin, not a family friend who had known me since I was a kid. And at first I thought maybe they just didn't know. Maybe it hadn't gotten around yet. But that hope didn't last long, because families like mine don't keep things quiet. They control the story, and my dad is very good at telling a version of events that makes him look reasonable, and once that version is out there, it sticks. And I started realizing that while I was sitting in a parking lot trying to figure out where I was going to sleep somewhere else, people were already hearing a completely different version of what happened, one where I wasn't the kid who got thrown out without a chance to explain. I was the problem. That finally got dealt with, the daughter who couldn't be controlled, the one who made her own choices and had to live with them. And it sounds crazy until you've lived it. How fast a story can change depending on who tells it first, and my dad always tells it first, and he tells it in a way that makes it easy for people to accept, because it removes the discomfort of having to question anything it gives. Everyone. A clean narrative where nobody has to feel guilty for not stepping in. And that's exactly what happened, because weeks later, when I finally did hear from someone, it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't concern or confusion. It was quiet acceptance of something I hadn't agreed to, like I had already signed off on being the bad guy, and nobody thought to ask for my side. And the worst part about that wasn't the betrayal, it was how normal it felt to them. Like this was just how things worked, like I had always been one step away from being the person they were now talking about. And I started to see how long this had been building, how the version of me they believed didn't come from that one night. It came from years of small moments where I didn't fit into the role they wanted me to play, and instead of adjusting the role, they adjusted the way they saw me. And once that shift happens, everything you do gets filtered through it. Every mistake becomes proof. Every disagreement becomes defiance. Every question becomes disrespect. And eventually you stop being a person in their eyes and start being a problem to manage. And problems don't get the benefit of the doubt, they get removed. And sitting there alone, looking at a phone that had nothing left to offer me, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Family isn't just about who raised you, it's about who shows up when it actually matters. In that moment, nobody from my family did, not one person chose to interrupt the story they had been told long enough to ask if it was true. And I know some people would say maybe they didn't know how, maybe they didn't want to get involved. But that's just a softer way of saying they made a decision, because staying out of it is still a choice. And every unanswered call, every ignored message, every quiet acceptance of a version of me that wasn't real, all of it added up to the same thing they chose, the easier story over the harder truth. And I sat there realizing that whatever I had lost that night wasn't just a place to live, it was the illusion that I had people who would stand up for me when it counted. And once that illusion is gone, it doesn't come back, no matter how much time passes or how many explanations you eventually get, because you can't unlearn the moment you needed someone and they decided not to be there. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and shifted in the driver's seat, trying to find a position that didn't make the cold feel like it was working its way straight into my bones. But there isn't really a comfortable way to sleep in a car that wasn't designed for it, especially when the heater just pushes out air that feels like it came from a refrigerator. And I remember thinking I could handle one night. Just one. People do worse all the time. I'd figure something out in the morning. But that confidence faded fast once the sun went down and the temperature dropped even lower, because cold at night is different. It doesn't just sit on your skin, it creeps in, slowly starts with your fingers and toes, then moves inward until everything feels stiff and heavy, and I kept flexing my hands. Like that would help, like I could keep the feeling in them just by refusing to let it go. And I watched my breath turn into fog inside the car, which would have been kind of interesting if it wasn't happening, because I was sitting there freezing and I tried to sleep. I really did lean the seat back as far as it would go, pulled my hoodie over my legs, tucked my hands under my arms, closed my eyes. But every time I got close to drifting off, something would wake me up, a noise outside, a car door slamming somewhere in the lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, or just the cold itself reminding me it wasn't going anywhere. And I ended up just staring at the ceiling of the car, counting minutes instead of hours, waiting for daylight, like it was gonna fix something. And when it finally came, it didn't. It just made everything look more real. The empty parking lot, the condensation on the windows, the fact that I was still there, with no plan, no place to go. And a phone that hadn't changed overnight, no missed calls, no messages, nothing. And I told myself I'd make some calls during the day, figure something out, but day turned into evening faster than I expected. And I found myself right back in the same situation, sitting in that car as the temperature dropped again, realizing this wasn't going to be a one-night problem. This was something I was actually living in now, and the second night felt worse. Not because it was colder, though it probably was, but because the reality had settled in. There was no illusion left that this was temporary or that someone was coming to fix it. And I moved the car to a quieter spot behind the public library, thinking maybe it would be safer, less attention, less noise, which turned out to be both true and not true at the same time, because around 3 in the morning, a bright light hit my window, and for a second my heart jumped into my throat. Because when you're alone like that, any interruption feels like a threat, and I sat up too fast, hit my head on the roof, and looked over to see a security guard standing outside. Older guy, gray mustache, holding a flashlight like he wasn't sure what he was about to find, and he knocked on the window, not aggressive, just firm enough to let me know he wasn't going away. So I rolled it down a little, and the cold air rushed in like it had been waiting for an excuse, and he looked at me for a second, took in the situation without saying anything right away, then asked, "You okay, miss?" And it caught me off guard, not the question itself, but the way he asked it, like he actually wanted the answer. And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine," because that's what you say when you don't want to explain your life to a stranger at 3 in the morning. And he nodded like he didn't believe me but wasn't going to push it, and just said, "All right, just checking," and walked away. And I sat there watching him leave, realizing that was the first time anyone had asked me that in 2 days. Not my dad, not my mom, not my sister, a man doing his job in a parking lot. And that hit harder than I expected, because it made something very clear, in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. The people who were supposed to care didn't, and the people who didn't have any reason to were the only ones who even noticed. I existed, and by the third night, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was starting to feel dangerous. My fingers went numb early, like around 9, and they didn't warm back up no matter how much I rubbed them together. And my feet felt like they weren't even part of my body anymore, just something attached that I couldn't feel properly. And I tried calling again that night, not because I expected a different result, but because doing nothing felt worse. And it was the same pattern. My dad blocked my mom, not answering. My sister straight to voicemail, 3 contacts, 3 silences. And I stared at the screen for a long time after the last call ended, thinking about how easy it would be for them to pick up, how little effort it would take to change everything, and how they were choosing not to. And around 11, something in me finally broke enough to try something different. And I called Rachel, my best friend, and she picked up on the second ring, like she'd been waiting for it. And the second I heard her voice, I couldn't even get words out. My jaw was shaking too much. My body was done pretending it could handle this, and she didn't ask a bunch of questions. It didn't make me explain everything right there. She just said, "Stay where you are," and hung up. And for the first time in 3 nights, I felt something other than cold, something like maybe I wasn't completely on my own. And about half an hour later, headlights cut across the lot, and her mom pulled up, got out, opened my car door, and took one look at me. Really looked not like she was trying to figure something out, but like she already knew. And I saw her expression change in a way that told me this was worse than I thought, because she didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I was there. She just wrapped a blanket around me, helped me into her car, and said, "You're safe now." Like that was the only thing that mattered. And in that moment, sitting there shaking in a stranger's passenger seat, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. If she hadn't come, I don't know how much longer I could have stayed out there like that. And that wasn't me being dramatic. That was just reality. Because cold doesn't care how strong you think you are, and neither does being completely alone. I let the heat from her car wash over my hands and face, and for a second, I didn't even realize how bad it had gotten until the feelings started coming back. In sharp, uncomfortable waves, like my body was reminding me what I'd been ignoring for 3 nights straight. And Diane didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence with questions, or try to make it lighter than it was. She just drove steady and focused, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the vents, so the warm air hit me directly. And that kind of quiet attention felt strange in the best way, because I wasn't used to being taken care of without having to explain or justify why I deserved it. And when we pulled into her driveway, Rachel was already standing on the porch in pajamas, arms crossed tight like she'd been holding herself together while she waited. And the second I stepped out of the car, she came down the steps and wrapped her arms around me, not saying anything at first, just holding on like she wasn't going to let me disappear again. And I didn't realize how much I needed that until it happened, because up until that moment, everything had been about surviving, getting through the next hour, the next minute. But standing there between them, I felt something shift. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to notice. Like, maybe I wasn't completely invisible anymore. And Diane didn't turn it into a big emotional scene. She just said, "Let's get you inside." Like this was practical, solvable, something you handle step by step. And once we were in, she moved quickly, but calmly handed me another blanket, set me down at the kitchen table, poured something warm into a mug, and slid it in front of me. And I remember staring at it for a second before taking a sip, because it felt almost unreal. Like I had gone from freezing in a car to sitting in a warm kitchen with people who actually noticed if I was okay, and my brain hadn't caught up yet, and Rachel sat across from me watching like she was making sure I didn't disappear again if she looked away for too long, and no one asked me to explain anything right then, which was probably the smartest thing they could have done, because if they had, I don't think I would have been able to get through it without falling apart completely. And instead, they gave me space to just exist for a minute without having to defend myself or prove anything, and that alone felt like a reset I didn't know I needed. And at some point, Diane said, "You're staying here tonight not as a question, not something I had to agree to or negotiate, just a fact." And I nodded because I didn't have the energy to argue even if I wanted to, and honestly, I didn't want to. And she led me upstairs to a guest room that smelled like laundry detergent and something faintly floral. And I remember noticing how clean everything was, how normal it looked, like a place where people slept every night without worrying about where they were going to be in the morning. And that contrast hit harder than anything else, because 3 nights in a car had lowered my expectations so much that a bed felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. And I sat on the edge of it for a second, still holding the blanket around my shoulders, not quite trusting that this was real. And Diane said, "Get some rest," like it was that simple, like rest was something you could just decide to do. And I lay down, and for the first time in 3 days, my body actually let go enough for me to sleep. Not a perfect sleep, not deep or uninterrupted, but enough that when I woke up it took a few seconds to remember where I was and why. And those few seconds were probably the closest I'd been to normal since everything started. And then it came back all at once. The hallway, the bag, the silence, and I just stared at the ceiling, letting it settle again. But it didn't feel exactly the same as before, because now there was something else in the room with it, something steadier, like a counterweight. And when I finally went downstairs, Diane was already in the kitchen making breakfast like it was just another morning. And Rachel was sitting at the table, hair still messy, eyes tired. But they're present, and neither of them treated me like I was fragile or broken. They just made space for me to sit down and be part of it. And Diane placed a bowl in front of me, and then sat across from me and said something I didn't and expect, not "What happened?" or "Why didn't you call sooner?" but "You deserve a seat at a table where you don't have to fight for a plate." And it sounds simple when you hear it, but in that moment it landed in a way nothing else had, because it reframed everything without asking me to relive it. It told me I wasn't the problem without making me argue for it, and I felt my throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold this time, and I cried, not quietly, not in a periculous, controlled way, just everything at once. And Rachel reached across the table and held my hand like she had the night before, and Diane just let it happen, didn't try to stop it or fix it, just stayed there until it passed. And when I could finally breathe again, that's when she laid out what came next, not as charity, not as something I owed her for, but as structure, clear and direct. "You can stay here rent-free under Fangs.com. Stay here. 3 conditions," and she listed them like she'd thought it through. "Finish your GED by spring. Get a part-time job. Start applying to community college by summer. No exceptions, no vague promises, just a plan." And I agreed to all of it without hesitation, because for the first time since that night, someone was offering me something real, not a way out of responsibility, but a way forward. And that was the turning point, not just because I had a place to stay, but because I had direction again, something to move toward instead of just something I was trying to survive. And later that day, when I sat alone for a minute, I realized how close I had come to slipping into something much worse than just a few nights in a car, because without that call, without Rachel picking up, without Diane showing up, there wasn't a next step waiting for me. There was just more of the same, more cold, more silence, more trying to figure it out on my own with no resources and no support. And I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because it's true, because turning points don't always look like big moments when you're in them. Sometimes they look like a woman opening a car door in a dark parking lot and saying, "You're safe now." And you don't realize until later that everything after that moment only exists because of it. I folded the blanket at the foot of the guest bed the next morning like I was checking into my own life for the first time, and then I got to work because Diane had made the terms clear and I wasn't about to waste the one shot I'd been given. So by Monday, I was standing behind a CVS register in a red vest that didn't quite fit, learning how to scan coupons and smile at people who didn't know anything about me. And in between shifts, I studied for my GED at the Hollis kitchen table with a stack of borrowed books and a timer on my phone, because structure was the only thing keeping me from spiraling, and none of it felt heroic or inspiring. It felt like doing the next small thing over and over until it added up to something that looked like progress. And 2 weeks in, I wrote my father a letter by hand, because part of me still thought, if I could just explain it the right way, if I could lay it out clearly, he might read it and realize what he'd done. So I kept it simple, told him the drugs weren't mine, told him I loved him, told him I just wanted to come home, and I mailed it on a Tuesday like it was a normal piece of mail instead of a last attempt at being heard. And 4 days later, it came back exactly the same as it left, sealed, untouched, with "return to sender" written across the front in his handwriting. And that was the moment something closed in me for good. Not anger, not even sadness. Just a quiet understanding that I was done trying to convince someone who had already decided not to listen. So I put the envelope in a shoebox under the bed and got back to work, because bills don't care about your emotional closure. And neither does rent, even if you're not paying it yet. And the practical side of being cut off hit fast in ways nobody warns you about. Like finding out my health insurance had been canceled when I tried to pick up my inhaler, and the pharmacist said my coverage was inactive, so I stood there in my own workplace and paid out of pocket for something I used to get for a $5 copay. And it wasn't just money, it was paperwork and timing, and all the small things that stack up when you don't have a stable address, like missing early financial aid deadlines because I couldn't prove where I lived yet, or realizing the savings account my mom had been adding to since I was 12 wasn't actually mine to access because it was under my dad's control. So that money just disappeared from my life without a conversation, and I learned quickly that independence isn't a mindset, it's a series of logistics. You either figure out or you don't. And I chose to figure it out, one form, one shift, one late night at a time. And while I was doing that, the version of me my family had created kept spreading without me there to correct it, because it's easier to believe a clean story than a complicated truth. So relatives heard I had a drug problem that I chose to leave that my dad had. Tried everything, and I just wouldn't listen. And I heard bits of it secondhand through people who didn't realize they were repeating something that wasn't real, and I stopped trying to fix it because chasing every rumor is a full-time job you don't get paid for. And I already had 2 actual jobs, CVS during the day and a diner on 5th Street at night, where I bussed tables and learned how to move fast without getting noticed. And I studied everywhere I could on breaks on the bus and the laundromat, while my clothes spun in circles like they had more direction than I did some days. And there were nights I sat in the Honda, in the Hollis driveway, because I wasn't ready to go inside and admit how tired I was, not just physically but mentally. The kind of tired that makes you question whether your father was right about you, whether maybe you are the problem and everyone else just figured it out before you did. And I hate that thought, but it showed up anyway, quiet and convincing, especially on days when nothing went right and everything felt heavier than it should. And one night it got loud enough that Diane found me on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet. Crying into a dish towel like that was somehow going to fix anything, and she didn't give me a speech or tell me it would all be okay. She sat down across from me and waited until I could look at her and said, "If you believe what he said about you, he wins," and that landed in a different way than anything else had, because it wasn't about feelings, it was about control. And I realized I had more of it than I thought, not over what had happened, but over what I did next. And the next week, I submitted my application to Columbus State's nursing program with a personal essay that didn't mention my family at all, just one line that felt true, that I wanted to take care of people who had no one. And when the acceptance letter came, Diane stuck it on the fridge with a pride of sunflower magnet, like it was the most normal thing in the world, and Rachel took a picture, and we kept moving, because that's what growth actually looks like. Not a big moment where everything changes, but a series of decisions that don't feel dramatic at the time: getting up for another shift, opening another textbook, choosing not to call someone who won't answer, choosing to build something instead of waiting for it to be handed back to you. And over time, those choices added up to something that looked a lot like a life. Not the one I thought I was going to have, but one I could stand in without feeling like I had to explain why I deserved to be there. I tightened my grip on the pen during a late-night study session and kept going, because at that point, stopping wasn't really an option anymore. It was either keep moving or risk sliding back into everything I had just fought my way out of. And nursing school didn't care about your backstory. It cared about your grades, your clinical hours, and whether you showed up ready to do the work. So that's what I did. I showed up even when I was exhausted from a double shift. Even when my feet hurt and my eyes burned from staring at textbooks under bad lighting, I showed up because I didn't have a safety net to fall back on. And that pressure, as uncomfortable as it was, became the thing that pushed me forward. Not in some dramatic motivational speech kind of way, but in a steady, almost stubborn way, like I had decided I wasn't going to become the version of myself my father had already written, and every test I passed, every skill I learned, every shift I survived felt like a quiet correction to that story. Not something I said out loud, just something I proved to myself over time. And the routine became my anchor: mornings at class, afternoons, studying nights at CVS or the diner, repeating it until it stopped feeling temporary and started feeling like my actual life. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was good at it. Not just getting by, actually good. I understood the material. I paid attention to details. I noticed things other people missed, and that wasn't something I had ever been told before, at least not in a way that stuck. So I didn't celebrate it. I just kept working, and the grades reflected that: a 3.8 gigapascals Dean's List, multiple semesters. Not because I was the smartest person in the room, but because I had a reason most people didn't. I knew exactly what it felt like to have nothing to fall back on, and that kind of clarity makes it easier to focus. And then graduation came up faster than I expected. One of those milestones you think will feel bigger when you get there. And in some ways it did, but not in the way people usually describe, because on graduation day I walked into a stadium full of families holding signs and flowers and cameras, and I sat there in my cap and gown, looking around at all these people who had someone in the crowd cheering for them, and I knew exactly who was in mine. Diane, Rachel, and 2 coworkers from the diner who had covered my shifts so I could study for finals. 4 people in a sea of hundreds, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't hit me. It did, because no matter how far you come, there's still a part of you that notices who isn't there, who didn't show up, who didn't even try. And when they called my name, I walked across that stage, shook the dean's hand, smiled for the camera like you're supposed to, and for a second, I let myself feel proud. Not loud or showy, just a quiet acknowledgement that I had done something real, something nobody could take away or rewrite. And then I went back to my seat, and it was over. No big celebration, no long list of people waiting to congratulate me. Just the same 4 faces who had been there the whole time. And honestly, that was enough, because they were the ones who had seen the work behind it, not just the result. and after that, things moved quickly in a different way. I started working at Riverside Methodist Hospital in the emergency department, which is exactly as intense as it sounds. Long shifts, constant movement decisions that matter. And I loved it, not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because it felt meaningful, like I was finally doing something that connected to everything I had gone through. And I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was contributing. And that shift from survival to purpose is harder to describe than people think. Because it doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual change in how you see yourself and in that environment. I found something else. I hadn't expected people who noticed how I worked, how I handled patients, how I stayed calm under pressure. And one of those people was Dr. Marcus Webb, an attending physician who didn't treat nurses like background noise, which already put him ahead of most. And one day he pulled me aside between cases and said something simple that stuck with me. "You don't just treat patients, you see them." And I didn't know what to say to that at first because no one had ever framed it that way. I had just been doing what felt right, paying attention, listening, not rushing people out the door, just because the system wanted me to, and he followed it up with a question I hadn't considered seriously before, whether I had thought about going further, becoming a nurse practitioner, and my first reaction was hesitation, not because I didn't want it, but because I wasn't used to thinking of myself as someone who could reach that level. And that's the part people don't talk about. Success isn't just about opportunity, it's about whether you believe you're allowed to take it. And for a long time I didn't, but having someone else say it out loud made it harder to ignore. So I looked into it, applied, wrote the essays, gathered the recommendations, and when I got accepted into the program at Ohio State, it didn't feel like a surprise as much as it felt like confirmation that all the work I had been doing actually meant something beyond just getting by, and I kept going through the same cycle of work and study, balancing shifts with classes, pushing through exhaustion because I had already learned how to function inside it. And I didn't suddenly become a different person. I was still the same one who had sat in a car wondering what came next, just with a different set of circumstances and a clearer direction. And that's what the rise actually looked like. Not a straight line, not a clean transformation, but a series of steps that built on each other until one day I could look back and see how far I had come, not because someone told me I was worth it, but because I had proven it to myself in ways that couldn't be undone. I set the acceptance letter down on my kitchen table and stared at it for a minute longer than necessary, because it wasn't just another step. It felt like a door opening into something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine yet. That idea stuck with me in a quiet way during my no problem program, not loud or dramatic. Just a steady thought in the background that kept coming back whenever I was working with patients who didn't have anywhere else to go. Especially the ones who slipped through the cracks because they didn't fit neatly into a system that expects you to have an address, insurance, or someone who can advocate for you. And I started noticing patterns, the same stories told in different ways. People who had served, worked, contributed, and still ended up sitting in waiting rooms, hoping someone would take them seriously for 5 minutes. And every time I saw that, it pulled me back to a parking lot. I didn't talk about much anymore, into what it feels like when nobody shows up. And I didn't connect all of it right away, but over time it started to form into something clearer, less like an idea and more like a direction. And one afternoon after a long shift, I was sitting in my apartment going over notes when it finally clicked in the way I couldn't ignore. Not just that I wanted to help people, but how specifically a clinic that didn't turn people away for the reasons I had seen too many times. A place that focused on homeless and uninsured veterans, people who had done their part and then got left to figure it out on their own. And the second that thought settled, it stopped feeling optional. It felt necessary, like the next logical step in everything I had been building, and that's where the real work started. Not the kind you see in highlight reels, but the kind that happens in meeting rooms and on phone calls, learning how things actually get built from the ground up. Because having a good idea is one thing, turning it into something real is something else entirely, and I spent months figuring out things I had never thought about before, writing grant proposals that had to explain not just what I want to do, but why it mattered, sitting across from nonprofit boards who asked questions I didn't always have perfect answers to, yet walking through empty storefronts with peeling paint and bad lighting, trying to imagine what they could become if given the chance. And it wasn't glamorous. There were days it felt like nothing was moving forward, like every step came with two more complications: zoning requirements, funding gaps, paperwork that never seemed to end. But I kept going because I had already learned how to build something from nothing, just on a smaller scale. And this was the same principle, just bigger, and I wasn't doing it alone, which made a difference in ways I didn't take for granted. Dr. Webb stepped in as a medical advisor, bringing experience and credibility I didn't have yet. Diane connected me with a veterans advocacy network. She had worked with opening doors that would have stayed closed otherwise. And slowly, piece by piece, things started to come together. A regional foundation approved a grant that became the backbone of the project, giving me enough to move from planning to action. And I found a space on Livingston Avenue, not perfect, but workable, something I could shape into what I needed it to be. And I remember standing inside it for the first time, after signing the paperwork, looking at the bare walls and empty floor, trying to picture what it would look like when it was finished, and realizing that this was the same feeling I had when I first sat at the Hollis kitchen table with a stack of books, and no clear idea how I was going to get from there to where I wanted to be, except this time I knew how the process worked. You don't wait for everything to be perfect. You start with what you have and build forward. And that's exactly what I did. Coordinating renovations, ordering equipment, setting up systems for patient intake and care, making sure that when the doors opened, it wouldn't just look like a clinic. It would function like one, efficiently, reliably, and most importantly, accessibly. And I named it Second Chance Community Clinic, not because I was trying to make a statement, but because it was the most accurate description of what I was trying to create: a place where people who had been overlooked or dismissed could walk in and be treated like they mattered. And when we finally opened, it wasn't a grand, dramatic moment. It was a series of small confirmations that the work had been worth it. The first patient who came in and sat down without hesitation, the first prescription filled for someone who thought they couldn't afford it. The first time I saw the system we had built actually work the way it was supposed to, and there was a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch who did a feature on the clinic, followed by a short segment on local news, and seeing it out there like that felt strange, not because I was uncomfortable with attention, but because the story being told was incomplete in a way I understood. It focused on the clinic, the service, the impact, which all mattered. But it didn't include the part that connected it back to why I cared so much in the first place. And that was fine, because not every story needs to be told in full to be meaningful. And I didn't build the clinic to prove anything to anyone. I built it because I knew exactly what it felt like to need help and not have it show up. And I didn't want anyone else to sit in that space longer than they had to. And over time, as the clinic grew, as more people came through the doors, as we expanded services and built relationships within the community, something else became clear to me. This wasn't just about helping others, it was about defining who I was on my own terms, separate from the version of me that had been created without my input years earlier. And that kind of identity doesn't come from what you say about yourself. It comes from what you build, what you show up for consistently, what you refuse to walk away from. And standing there in that clinic, watching it function, seeing people cared for in a way that felt right, I understood that this wasn't just the result of everything I had been through, it was the answer to it, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that gave it context. And for the first time, the direction I was moving in didn't feel like an escape from something. It felt like a choice I had made for myself, and that made all the difference. I tapped open the message and stared at the screenshot long enough for the screen to dim and lock, then unlocked it again, like maybe the words would rearrange into something less precise if I gave them time. But they didn't. They sat there exactly as sent, time-stamped, casual, and clear in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. Lol. I moved my stuff to Shelby's desk just in time. Dad's about to lose it, followed by a laughing emoji that somehow made it worse, because it turned something that changed my life into a punchline, and I didn't react right away, not outwardly. I just stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, listening to the quiet tick of the wall clock like it had suddenly gotten louder. And Megan was still on the line waiting for me to say something, apologizing again, telling me she didn't notice it back then, that she should have, that she was sorry, and I told her it wasn't on her because it wasn't. She didn't write the message. She just found it. But that didn't make what I was looking at any easier to process, because this wasn't a suspicion anymore. It wasn't a theory I could push aside when it got uncomfortable. It was proof, simple, direct, and dated. To the exact time everything fell apart, and the first thing I felt wasn't anger, which I expected. It was something closer to stillness, like my brain had decided to slow everything down so it could actually take in what this meant without getting overwhelmed. And what it meant was straightforward in a way that made it harder to argue with. The bag wasn't mine. It had never been mine. It had been placed there deliberately by the one person in that house who knew exactly how my father would react and exactly how to position herself to look innocent when he did. And for 12 years, I had lived with the consequences of that one decision while she stayed exactly where she was, protected, supported, believed, and I stayed where I was. Outside of all of it, building something separate without the context that would have explained everything from the start, and I walked over to the kitchen table and sat down because my legs didn't feel like they were going to hold me. If I stayed standing, and I read the message again, slower this time, paying attention to the details I had missed. At first, the tone, the timing, the fact that it wasn't written like a warning or a confession. It was written like a joke shared between friends. Something light. Something almost entertaining, and that part stayed with me longer than anything else because it reframed not just what she did but how she saw it, not as a serious choice with real consequences, but as a moment she could laugh about in a text thread, and that realization brought something else up with it. Not rage, not yet, but a deep, steady clarity that settled in without asking permission. Because once you see something like that in plain terms, you don't have to keep guessing anymore. You don't have to replay old conversations or second-guess your memory. The answer is right there, and I saved the screenshot without thinking about what I was going to do with it. Just that I needed. It needed to keep it somewhere. I could find it again, and then I put my phone down and sat there for a long time without moving, letting the weight of it settle into place, and it didn't feel like a dramatic reveal the way people think it should. There was no sudden rush of energy or immediate plan for what came next. It felt more like a line being drawn, a point where everything before it made sense in a way it hadn't before, and everything after it would have to be handled differently, and that's when the second layer of it started to come into focus. Not just what she did, but what it cost, not in abstract terms, not as a general idea of loss, but in specific, measurable ways. 3 nights in a car in freezing weather, a returned letter that never got read, years of being labeled something I wasn't, relationships that never had a chance to exist because the foundation they were built on was wrong from the start, and I didn't go through each of those one by one in that moment, but I felt them all at once, compressed into something that didn't need to be explained to anyone else, to be real. And for the first time since that night, I stopped questioning whether I could have done something differently. Whether there was some version of events where I said the right thing or acted the right way, and it would have changed the outcome, because the outcome had been set before I even knew there was a situation to respond to, and that realization removed something I had been carrying without noticing the raw idea that I was partly responsible for what happened, and once that was gone, what was left was much simpler, not easier but clearer. I had been wronged in a way that wasn't accidental, and I had the proof to back it up, and that changed the equation entirely, because now it wasn't just my word against a narrative that had already been accepted, it was evidence that could stand on its own, and I leaned back in my chair and looked around my apartment at the life I had built piece by piece without any of them in it, and I thought about what this meant for that life, whether it needed to be brought into it at all, and I didn't have an immediate answer. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to rush into anything, I wasn't going to fire off a message or confront anyone in the heat of that moment, because I had lived with the consequences of impulsive decisions made by other people, and I wasn't going to repeat that pattern, so I closed the comment and screenshot, not deleting it, just putting it away for now, and I stood up and went back to what I had been doing before the call, reviewing notes, checking schedules, continuing with the routine that had carried me this far, but underneath that routine, something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore because I wasn't moving forward with the same uncertainty anymore. I was moving forward with full picture, and that picture included a truth that had taken 12 years to surface, not because it was hidden well, but because no one had been looking for it, and now that it was here, now that it was undeniable, it didn't just explain the past, it gave me control over how I chose to respond to it, and that more than anything else was what made it a turning point, not the discovery itself, but what it allowed me to do next. I closed my laptop after reading his second message and sat there longer than I expected, not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I wanted to make sure I said it for the right reason, not out of anger, not to get even, just to put the truth where it belonged, and stop carrying it around like it was still mine to manage. And once that became clear, the rest of it followed pretty quickly. I opened a new document, typed the date at the top, November 14th, 2013, and started writing. Not a speech, not a performance, just a record of what actually happened. One piece at a time. The hallway, the bag, the way he didn't ask a single question, the way I walked out with everything I owned in a trash bag, while he looked past me like I wasn't even there. The 3 nights in, the car, the calls that went unanswered, the letter I sent and he returned unopened. And I didn't exaggerate anything because I didn't need to. The facts were enough on their own. And then I moved forward, the GED, the jobs, nursing school graduation, with 4 people in the audience. The clinic not to prove anything, but to show him what he had missed, not by accident, but by choice. And I kept my tone steady the entire time because this wasn't about making him feel worse, it was about making sure he understood what had actually happened, without the version he had been telling himself and everyone else. And when I got to the part that mattered most, I paused for a second, not because I wasn't sure, but because I knew this was the piece that would change everything. And I attached the screenshot. Megan sent me the one message that connected all the dots, in a way nothing else could, and I explained it in one sentence, simple and direct, that the drugs he found were never mine, that they had been placed there, and that his decision that night had been based on something that wasn't true. And then I attached the photo of the letter he had returned, still sealed, still untouched, and I didn't add commentary to it because it spoke for itself, and I ended it the only way that made sense, not with a question, not with an invitation, but with a boundary, that I didn't hate him, but I couldn't give him the reunion he was asking for, that I wasn't going to be part of a version of the story that erased what actually happened, and that if he wanted any kind of relationship with me, it would have to start with accountability, not one apology, not one message, but consistent action over time. And I read it through twice, made a few small edits to keep it clear, then copied it into a reply and hit send at 11:47 p.m. And after that, there was nothing left to do. I had said what needed to be said, given the truth back to the person who created the situation in the first place, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. I went to bed that night without checking my phone again. And I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind was finally quiet, in a way it hadn't been before, like something that had been running in the background for years had finally been turned off. And I didn't hear from him right away, which I expected, but I did hear about what happened next, not directly from him, but through the same network that had carried his version of the story all those years. Only this time it was different, because now there was something concrete behind it. And from what I was told, he read the message in silence, didn't react the way people expect in those situations. No yelling, no immediate defense, just quiet. And then he got up, walked outside, and sat in his truck for an hour, and he cried. Not the controlled kind, the kind that doesn't ask permission. And I've thought about that a lot, not in a way that brings me satisfaction, just in a way that tries to understand what that moment actually meant, whether it was regret, guilt, or just the shock of having his version of events replaced with something he couldn't argue with. And the truth is, it probably doesn't matter which one it was, because the result was the same. The narrative changed, not because it chose to change it, but because it couldn't hold up anymore, and that shift moved through the rest of the family faster than anything else. Had conversations that should have happened years ago finally happened. Questions that should have been asked at the beginning finally got asked, and the version of me that had been accepted without question started to fall apart under the weight of actual evidence, and I didn't have to be there for any of it. I didn't have to argue or defend myself or convince anyone the fairness. Truth did that on its own, and that was the part that felt the most different, because for 12 years I had been the only one carrying it. The only one who knew exactly what had happened and had to live with the gap between that and what everyone else believed. And now that gap was gone, not erased, but exposed. And I didn't feel lighter because he cried or because people started to see things differently. I felt lighter because I wasn't the only one holding it anymore. And when he finally reached out again, this time through email, it was different, not polished, not trying to control the tone, just straightforward, acknowledging that he had been wrong and that there wasn't an excuse that made it acceptable. And I read it carefully, not looking for a perfect apology, because those don't exist, but for something real, and it was closer than anything I had gotten before. And I took a few days to respond, because I wanted to be just as clear as I had been in my first message. And when I did, I kept it simple, that I appreciated him hearing me, but that it didn't undo what had happened. That trust isn't rebuilt with one message or one moment. It takes time and consistent behavior, and that I needed space not as punishment but as a boundary. And he respected that, at least so far, and that's where things stand. Not fixed, not resolved, in the way people like to wrap stories up, but honest. And that matters more to me than a clean ending ever could, because what I learned through all of this isn't that everything works out if you just wait long enough. It's that you get to decide what you carry and what you put down. And for a long time, I carried something that wasn't mine to begin with. And the moment I gave it back, everything else started to make sense in a way it hadn't before. Not easier, just clearer, and sometimes that's enough.